So we started being invited to play in places where you didn't have to play tunes that people recognised, and one of these was UFO. And the great thing about UFO was that I think the audience was so stoned and they lay around on the floor that they really had no idea what you were playing. They couldn't have sung along with any tune if they knew it anyway. So you could really do anything you liked. And Mark Boyle was doing wonderful light shows and turned it into a kind of magic space.
Welcome to the Bureau of Lost Culture, your home for all things countercultural, oral testimonies from the underground, half-remembered, half-forgotten stories from the upside down. I'm Stephen Coates, and that was Robert Wyatt from Soft Machine, from Memories of the UFO Club and the fantastic light shows there. You couldn't turn up at any self-respecting psychedelic hangout, countercultural club, happening, being, or even disco in the late 60s and 70s without being immersed in a cosmic cloud of swirling, dreamy liquid lights, images, forms, and symbols illuminating and enhancing the music. Now, if we took a trip in a time machine back to those days, we might find those light shows a bit primitive, given the multimedia, high-tech, laser extravaganzas we've got used to. But the light shows of the 60s and 70s were genuinely revolutionary, mind-bending, consciousness-enhancing, state-altering, especially if augmented by a dose of LSD. But more on that in a moment. Thanks to John, Rags and Susie for their support this last month. Come and join them and us at the Bureau of Lost Culture.com. Now, let's trip the light fantastic. I'm joined today by my countercultural companion in arms, Kevin Foakes, DJ Food turntablist, graphic designer par excellence, and now author. His wonderful new book, Wheels of Light, published by Four Corners Books, is a trip through the history of the British light show from 1970 to 1990. And it's a gorgeous multicoloured sensory experience all by itself, filled with amazing artwork and images. And we're joined by Neil Rice, co-founder of Optokinetics, one of the main suppliers of the projectors and gizmos that created the psychedelic light show. And Jenny Caldwell, travelling light J for many bands in the second summer of love, including those sonic assassins, Hawkwind. But Kev, let's start with you. First of all, congratulations on this beautiful book.
Thanks very much, Stephen.
Yeah, and welcome back to the Bureau of Lost Culture.
Yeah, feels weird to be an author as well.
Well, you add it to your sort of long list of achievements. I mean, let's just go through them. So, how many albums with DJ Food?
I've lost count. Recorded albums, mixed albums, hours of radio.
Remixes,
yeah.
Hundreds of artists, so many out. And then, of course, designer, how many record covers now?
Lost count, that's the next book, I think.
Record covers. And then, of course, live DJing.
Yep. Recently,
the turntablist stuff. Well, always been a turntablist, but you've invented this crazy 4-deck turntable, which I still don't quite understand. But
I call it the quadraphon. It's a 4-arm turntable, so you can play 4 different parts of the same record off the same deck. You can move 3 of the arms backwards and forwards, and I build up soundscapes through using locked groove records, which I play at 4 different points, all put through a mixer and effects.
There's all the other graphic stuff that you do as well, including stuff for Ninja and all your long history of that. So how did you get time to write this book? In fact, just to add in too as well, you've just designed the sleeves for my last 4 albums, a lot of other stuff. So, I mean, do you actually go to sleep?
I go to sleep pretty late, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I did wonder if you mentioned your albums.
And also, let's mention your online blog, which is a kind of collection of the crazy imagery and stuff that you come across, mainly sort of music-based stuff, isn't it? Countercultural stuff too. You've been doing posting a lot of stuff from International Times and
stuff like that. Generally graphic and musical things, either historical or visual. I take a lot of street art pictures as well. Always photographed graffiti since the 80s. Just generally visually always aware. We've crossed over and many times on these things.
Well, I'm going to put links to all your stuff actually in the show notes. But actually this book, which has just come out, I mean, just tell us about the genesis of that then.
Well, this happened in mid-2019, pre-COVID. I got a call from Paul Noble, who works at Spiritland, who'd just been up to the Optokinetics HQ in Luton, where he lives, discovered a huge planned chest of artwork with all this original wheel art from picture wheels. And you probably know another one, another list of my resume is I've got a night called Further with my friend Pete Williams, which we do occasionally, which is all submersive sort of psychedelic visuals, slides, oil wheels, that sort of thing.
But okay, well, but let's have some definitions. So, I mean, we talk about light shows, so which, as I mentioned in the intro, we're all used to these kind of super high-tech ones now, aren't we, right? But back in the day, right, and they really kind of got going, maybe in America first, right, I think?
Yes, definitely.
West Coast. I mean, I did an interview last time with Ken Babbs, who's one of the Merry Pranksters, and their acid tests, one of the Merry Pranksters, I can't remember which one, was experimenting then, with lights and stuff. But also, you talk about in the book, the Boyle family, right?
Yeah.
Doing this stuff in quite early 60s, right?
Yeah, early 60s. Mark Boyle and Joan Hills, collectively known as the Boyle family, and later with their children. Yeah, they, the art set really, they were the cutting edge, as they always are. The avant-garde were the first, and they were doing happenings in their home initially, and then art galleries, and then they got sort of co-opted into the clubs like UFO, and then ended up touring with Hendrix and Soft Machine around the US.
Yeah, right. So we'll come back to that in a second. So, I mean, of course, at the time, so, from the sort of late 50s, rock and roll's kicked off, right? And then you're moving into the 60s and all sorts of stuff's changing. But really, in a way, the most interesting thing about bands was often just their outfits, wasn't it? I mean, you went to a gig and it was the band, wasn't it? And, the band would play for a short gig, maybe 4 or 5 bands at a gig, and it was, you looked at the band, didn't you? And then suddenly this thing happens whereby either the band's not enough or a combination of the new technology and experimentation and all the other stuff that's going on.
It's the classic thing, isn't it? Different elements collide for usually a couple of years tops and just create this perfect synergy. Punk happened 10 years after. And that technology coming out of the art galleries and going into the clubs literally lit everything on fire. It was quite a monochrome world up until that point. And the clubs basically just suddenly came awash with colour. TV was black and white.
TV was black and white, right? Yeah. So you've got the whole swinging 60s things kicking off in all other respects, isn't it? Fashion, music, but I think the drugs is part of it too. Not that the actual drugs. Well, maybe it's a combination. You've got drugs. You've also got new technologies, and I thought the other thing is just to sort of define some of these terms. So we talk about light shows, but in those days, what were the options? What was it made up of? You talk about oil, you talk about slides and wheels. Just give us a run through of the actual gizmos.
There's a difference between UK light shows and American light shows, and American light shows were liquids. They were called sort of liquid shows or wet shows sometimes, and people got 2 clock faces and submerged ink and oil in between the two and squashed it together and basically projected that from overhead projectors. Over here, there was a bit of that. There were slide projectors, there was Cine Super 8 film and things like that. And later on, these wheels came out with pictures, liquids, and more effects. That was a bit more into the 70s, though. That's what my book, it's jumping off from the end of the 60s into when this thing became a sort of business, really.
Yeah, so I want to dig in a bit. So just to understand it, so it was quite handmade in some ways as well, wasn't it? So let me understand it. So you're getting, say, 2 pieces of glass, for instance, right? And you're injecting different liquids in between them, and in the way that kind of oil and water goes all weird and stuff like that. Different coloured liquids. Yeah. And then you're shining a light through that. That's what it is, the projector, right? Yeah. But you sort of, and then also you get the wheel to move. And so it's this continually evolving.
No, that's slightly different. That's okay. A wheel is separate to the clock faces and the oil. That's literally our overhead projector, the kind of thing you'd have in school, where the teacher would write on this thing and then it would project out onto the school classroom wall. Right. They were literally co-opting things like that, and raiding science catalogues for oils and liquids and all sorts of microscopes and lenses and prisms, and they started sticking prisms and kaleidoscopes in front of projection lenses to divide up and move around the image, and just distortion techniques basically.
Right. So quite experimental. So who were the first bands, or what was it more like the clubs that started to take it out of the galleries and associate it more with music and happenings and stuff?
Well, in the UK you had places like the Drury Lane Arts Lab and places like that. I think that was some of the earliest kind of happening places outside of galleries. And then you had UFO, of course, which was late 66. And you had people like Mark Boyle working there, a few others as well. He wasn't exclusively there. But, you know, once UFO jumped off, it was very quickly followed by several others like Middle Earth, and it's Happening 44, I think, is another one. You know, and from by the early 70s, there were literally hundreds of light shows in the UK. And my book is very UK based. I must state that as well. The US scene is just huge,
right,
and the European as well.
Sure. So we've mentioned UFO many times on this show, right? Club just around the corner, and the home of psychedelia. Sort of this very short-lived small place, wasn't it? With a few hundred people hanging out for
well, again, less than a year.
Less than a year, right? Yeah. And so the Boyle family got involved, the Mark Boyle family got involved with lighting bands like Soft Machine and Floyd there, right? There's some pretty famous footage, isn't there, of Floyd on stage there, getting kind of washed in, Syd Barrett getting washed in lots of different colours. I
think initially the story goes that Boyle was actually co-opted into UFO to be one of the main acts, and because they were doing presentations and sort of shows of their own, and he basically just stayed on because Soft Machine were on after them, and he just did the lights for Soft Machine, and that's kind of a bit of serendipity that just connected the music and the art world suddenly.
Yeah, and I think that what's quite interesting is that, do you think that it actually had an effect on the music? Because when there's a light show like that, particularly when it's projected, you know, and it's a lot of stuff going on, the musicians don't have to sort of think so much about doing stuff like they were doing at the early 60s with routines and stuff, do they? And also the whole ambience of the place changes, right? So you're going to get a lot of people lying down off their boxes, right, looking at the lights, right, and it's going to be much more of a three-dimensional sensory experience. So do you think that sort of fed back into the kind of music that they were doing?
I think for the audience it must have been incredible. I mean, a lot of those bands were jamming, weren't they? Or they were improvising. You know, Floyd did a lot of improvising, and so was the Soft Machine. You know, and it can only have just heightened the effect, I suppose. If you're on acid as well, who knows?
Well, I was just thinking that as well, because it gives the band a certain amount of freedom as well, doesn't it? Or the band might start to respond to the actual
band
lights,
can hide.
right? Yeah.
The band can hide in the lights, and a lot of bands did. Bands like Dan Tallion's Chariot painted their equipment white and wore white, so that when they were projected onto, they kind of disappeared into the stage. You know.
And you think about the late 60s, that was, certainly for the underground bands, that was the thing to do, wasn't it? It wasn't about sort of like, you know, either the front man or front woman.
No.
You know, and sort of, imagine the Beatles with their kind of matching outfits and stuff. Is that the whole vibe was that you were too cool for that, right? You sort of, you know, it was all part of this kind of three-dimensional thing. You mentioned that about the audience, and did you come across many, you know, accounts of what it was like for people seeing this stuff for the first time? You know,
there's not too much of that in the book, I have to admit, and it's the worst thing for us was trying to get any kind of photographic evidence of a lot of this stuff being projected, because a lot of it, there isn't much. No one, you know, with any sense had a really good camera on them, and you know, could deal with low levels of light in that kind of environment, and they were probably too busy having a good time anyway. There are a few, there's bits and pieces. There's actually more film than actual photography, but that was the really difficult part, was trying to find images that would just show this stuff in context.
I'm just thinking, because for, you know, until people got used to it, which it must have been genuinely mind-bending,
I'd imagine.
You know, to come into a place like UFO, particularly if you've dropped a tab, and then the band kicks off and the lights kick off. I mean, it was kind of revolution, wasn't it? Revolution in the head, right?
Yeah, lots of syncopation, lots of, you know, the light show they wouldn't just turn the projectors on and just let them run. They would be literally playing the light along with the bands, you know, pulling things out, using a sort of a gate effect on the projection light by moving their hand over it.
Right, it's like a strobing,
and burning their hands and getting covered in this liquid, and some of them using really explosive materials and liquids and stuff, and it was actually quite dangerous.
Yeah, well, I think you talk about the Boyle from that. They were burning slides and stuff, weren't they?
Yeah.
But actually burning stuff underneath the lights,
yes,
right?
Exactly. Yeah, getting stuff to bubble and heat up.
Yeah, I'd like to see getting that past the contemporary health and safety officer.
Well, look at Arthur Brown, though. Arthur Brown coming in with his flaming helmet, for I am the god of hellfire.
Oh, right, he set his helmet on fire.
Yeah,
did he? Yeah.
yeah.
We're not going to get away with that these days. Kev, just flicking through the book, I mean, it is quite extraordinary. I mean, I know we're going to talk a little bit more with Neil and Jenny about how this stuff evolved, but the artwork, I mean, of these slides, maybe you can talk a little bit about the artists, because these are like circular paintings. They look like sort of psychedelic picture discs, records, and they're full of this kind of wonderful, sometimes psychedelic, sometimes not, intricate, rotating art. It's almost like, a sort of aerial view of a globe or something, isn't it?
That's
because
right.
they went round and round in circles. So
Yeah.
rather than doing a straight picture, you basically had to do a circular picture, which I know you're a fan of anyway. So tell us about some of the artists and who did this stuff.
Well, some of the original artists were actually noted sci-fi cover artists. David Hardy, who did the first panoramic picture wheel, used to do Patrick Moore covers and things like that, space scenes and stuff, and that was some of the first things. And they had to be intricate, because when you're blowing them up to huge size, meters and meters across the wall, so you need detail, because you're going to literally be zooming in to that tiny little wheel. The wheels are only about 6 inch, but the original art is usually much, much bigger, so like 24 inch.
So they make a big piece of art, shrink it down photographically, put it on a small-ish glass slide.
Yeah,
basically.
between glass,
right,
yeah.
Yeah, and then go big on the walls, right?
Yeah.
And then, of course, it wasn't just one thing, wasn't it? They were overlapping stuff as well. So you'd have the artwork.
Yeah, you don't just project one image. It was like collage on a wall, basically, layers and layers. So you'd have liquids. Some wheels have liquids in them that basically, when the wheel revolves and heats up, they bubble and mix the colours. Some have sort of op art sort of patterns, like Bridget Riley paintings that swivel between two layers of the same pattern and create a moire effect. And others have wheels, and then you've got strobes, you've got all sorts of other things, prisms, like I was saying, things that mirrors that shoot the image around the room and things like this. And also, importantly, they went across the whole environment, the ceiling, the walls, everything across the stage. There wasn't a sort of rectangle like if you went to the cinema. You're inside a moving, living, breathing environment. And I imagine with the right psychedelics in you, that was just incredible.
Absolutely, yeah. So let's sort of whip through a quick history of it. So starts off with, in Britain anyway, with the Boyles, and then it sort of moves from art galleries into clubs and happenings and stuff like that.
And very much, the music at that point kicked off internationally. So these crews started touring with some of the bands. They were going around the world influencing people. Obviously, the Americans had got there first and influenced us. But and then come the 70s, there were bona fide businesses making their living selling this equipment to light shows. Slowly, things change, music changes. I heard a great quote from Eno yesterday, which said, it's always more fun when there's no business plan. Once the business kicks in, and the same with music and everything, things change. Managers want lighting on their main star. They don't want them to hide behind psychedelics, and music changes too, and the technology has to change and adapt. And in the 70s you get disco, all the different kind of things that come in with that, lasers, that sort of thing. Eventually we get to the 80s, 90s, and video comes in. A lot of this stuff becomes completely obsolete until the second time comes around.
Second time around. But just before we get onto that, I mean, just to step back a bit, I mean, think about Pink Floyd, right? So, a band that really got going at UFO with the light shows. And for them, the visual aspect of their show remained, in fact, increased, didn't it?
Oh,
They
definitely.
got bigger and bigger and bigger. So when they started to do, when they became a global phenomenon and they were touring the world with these huge, Dark Side of the Moon, massive, not just light shows, but whole kind of theatrical things. And in their case, the wall, the visual aspect of it became the thing. They were actually hidden behind a wall, right?
Yes.
I mean, they're the band that took it to the kind of logical extreme of anonymity.
I think so, yeah, definitely. And the trouble with that as well is because Floyd essentially became a stadium band, the light shows couldn't cope.
Right.
They couldn't project that big and that bright.
Right.
The technology wasn't there. You had to go to another level, and they had to go with the technology that could actually light that stuff. So a lot of the light show crews couldn't quite manage.
Also, you know, 70s, let's not forget, you know, punk comes along, rejects all those bands, right, largely, you know, in the kind of the pomposity of it all, right? And I imagine that the last thing that your self-respecting punk band at the 100 Club 112 was like a hippie there with an oil slide and projecting that stuff, right?
Yeah, everyone cut their hair overnight. Everything went monochrome. It was all about strobes and speed, wasn't it?
Yeah, right. And you wanted to be up close with the band as well, right? You didn't want anything getting in the way.
No.
So it wasn't really, so it was a different thing altogether. So all that kind of business, and we're going to hear from Neil, I know about it, but all that business sort of in a way went through a major dip, right? Until that renaissance with Second Summer of Love and all that stuff, when people were like, oh, let's go psychedelic again, right? So they started to, did it get out the old gear and dust it down, or was there new stuff coming along?
As everything, you know, part of it came in and coupled with what was currently happening as well. You know, you had early video projection, you had lasers by that point, and all that sort of stuff from the disco era, and people, they mutated it in the same way as the music mutated, and it became a sort of a version of itself. I mean, we weren't there in the 60s to see the original, but we were there in the 80s to see that version. I can't imagine it was quite the same, but you know, taking those techniques.
Well, certainly when I first came to London, which is in the, I think in the mid-90s, Whirligig was using, I'm pretty sure they were using that sort of stuff.
Yeah, oh, definitely,
right, and Barefoot Beanfeast and Club Dog and stuff, right?
Yeah, there were people that kind of flew the flag through the 80s, and bands like Hawkwind definitely kept that torch burning.
Absolutely. And now, is it still a niche thing to use this kit, apart from at your book launch with the night or something?
I think we've been a sort of third summer of psychedelic love for about the last 10 years. You know, there's really been a huge resurgence in interest in psychedelic music and culture in the last 10, 15 years. And I've seen, you know, new light shows coming to the fore the last decade, certainly, you know, and even in the last few years. And those bands that are sort of flying the contemporary psychedelic flag, they want the light show. They want that old thing. They don't want something clean and digital as much.
Well, good. Very glad to hear it. Let's have a little listen to this. I think it's from a British Pathé thing, Kev, possibly, right? It's talking about Mike Leonard, who, of course, was the Pink Floyd's landlord, lecturer, and light show operator for a bit.
He was. They were originally called Leonard's Lodges before Pink Floyd.
A wise change of name, I think.
The basic idea, thought up by architect Mike Leonard, is that light projected through polished but strangely shaped perspex lenses can be bent, fractured, dissipated, and dissolved into an endless series of shifting patterns. Using a transparent color chart, which revolves the opposite way to another with a simple black pattern painted on it, he projects a moving design. As soon as one of his perspex lenses is added, Leonard transforms the screen into a myriad of multiplying colored motions. Psychedelic light shows apart, it can be used for shop windows, special theater effects, and even in the home as an everlasting, ever-changing wallpaper. Even with one lens, the picture never quite repeats itself. With 100 or more concave, convex, fluted or convoluted plastic eyes, you really have got the light fantastic.
Well, listen, why don't we turn to our first guest, Neil Rice. Hello, Neil. Give us a quick introduction.
I'm Neil Rice, one of the founder directors of Optikinetics, a company that was established in 1970 to make effects and effects projectors for light shows.
Well, Neil, give us a picture of who you were during the 60s and how old you were and what you're into and what were the shows you were going to, the bands, you know, what were they actually like?
My first ever gig was one of those cinema theatre tours. So the first live show I ever saw, I think I was age 12 or 13, was headlined by the Everly Brothers. Then there was Bo Diddley and then the Rolling Stones. So I mean, I was just hooked on live music. A school friend had an older sister who used to go to the Crawdaddy Club in Richmond and see the Stones in the early days, and promoters had started bringing over American bluesmen, John Lee Hooker and Muddy Waters and people like this, and she had a record collection. and we used to go round to his house and listen to his sister's records. So I just got fascinated by the growth of 60s music. And of course, as most people know, that kind of R&B blues thing actually obviously turned into rock music, or whatever you want to call it. I mean, I actually saw, I think within the space of 1 week, I saw Eric Clapton's last gig with the Yardbirds, his first gig with John Mayall in my local youth club, where there were probably only 30 people there. And then the following week, Jeff Beck's first gig was Clapton's replacement in the Yardbirds. I mean, it kind of went on from there, and then the other key band was John Mayall, and then Graham Bond organisation, which had Jack Bruce and Ginger Baker, who were the other two members with Eric Clapton in the Cream.
Your first experience of a light show was seeing Zoot Money's Dantalians Chariot at a festival, wasn't it? Where was that?
There was the Windsor Jazz Festival. Well, I went in '66, saw Cream's first performance. And the following year, there was this band called Pink Floyd that I'd heard all about that was supposed to have a fabulous light show, but at the time, Syd Barrett was unwell, and for that reason, Pink Floyd didn't turn up. Unbeknownst to me, Zoot Money, who I'd seen with his big roll band, sort of playing soul music, had suddenly gone psychedelic himself with a new band called Dantalians Chariot, and they just had this blinding overhead light show, which we assumed he'd brought over from America, but in recent years, through doing research with Kevin and other people like Pooter from Pooterland, we actually researched it and found that it was actually a UK light show, and they'd chosen to call themselves the Overheads, and it was an American style overhead light show that I'd seen that accompanied Zoot Money. But I mean, as it was sort of the first major light show I'd ever seen, I didn't know what equipment was involved.
Can you remember what you felt like when you saw it? I mean, what did it look like?
Yeah, it was a life-changing experience, really.
And you also saw Mark Boyle?
Yeah.
At Middle Earth?
Yeah, I saw him a couple of times at Middle Earth. It was just mind-blowing. I mean, Blitzkrieg. Yeah, I just really fell in love with music, records, live gigs, but I'm totally unmusical myself, can't sing or play a musical instrument. Doing the lighting was the next best thing. And so I started doing that as a hobby initially with a school friend, and then discovered Krishna Lights up in London. I'd left school by then, 67, finished my A-levels, went to work sort of articled in an architect's office, and the light shows just got the better of me, and I threw in my apprenticeship with the architects and went up to London and worked for Krishna Lights. I mean, my father was just furious.
Can you give us a bit of history on Krishna Lights, Neil?
Krishna Lights was run by a chap called Jimmy Doody. The reason the company was called Krishna Lights is it was tied up with the Radha Krishna temple in London. But it was based in Goode Street off Tottenham Court Road in a basement under a tobacconist. And he was in partnership with a chap called Keith Cannadine. We bought projectors, made these liquid wheels, and they were sold more or less as works of art at relatively high value. The Beatles used to buy them for their office at the Apple building.
And you started doing it with a mate, did you, for local bands?
Yeah, just in church halls and...
Making your own gear?
No, it was using converted slide projectors, but yeah, a lot of the modifications. I think one of them was relatively unique, because instead of totally removing the heat filter, I managed to cut a slot in the top of the projector and put a frame around the heat filter so I could lift it up and down to control the amount of heat going onto the slides. If it was bubbling too much, I could drop the heat filter back down and cool it down a bit.
So what did your light show consist of?
I just had 4 of those projectors behind me, and probably a strobe that was sort of the brightest 500 watt regular sort of photographic lamp in a box with a spinning high-speed wheel on the front with a hole cut in it to simulate a strobe.
And Neil, did you try and sort of respond to the music that was going on?
Oh, very much so. You sort of follow the beat, or there's a quiet passage, you calm things down, but yeah, it was very manual and very hands-on.
Where would the strobe come in then?
That was typically during a drum solo. I mean, a lot of it was if there were 2 projectors superimposed with liquid slides on the screen, you'd actually use your hands as shutters to flap over the front of the lenses and flash them alternately and play the music. So it's a bit like drumming. In fact, Jasper Johns, who was the fruit salad light show with the Osric Tentacles, he was a drummer. I've met a few light show operators that used to be drummers that have come from the back of the stage to the back of the hall and taken over on the lights.
What about drugs? Any drugs involved?
I was late to drugs. I sort of sat back and watched what was happening to other people. I was very late teens before I smoked my first joint. Oh, actually, it was during the workshop in Acton in Goodge Street one Friday afternoon. I don't think I was actually slipped acid. I think I sort of took it willingly. And that evening we were due to light Juicy Lucy at the Sisters Club in Seven Sisters Road. I lived in Ealing at the time with my flatmates. Somehow we managed to get the equipment down from the top floor and into the back of the Krishna Lights minivan. And Keith Cannadine drove, and I sat in the passenger seat, and he passed me an A to Z, which I opened, and I could just see this mass of wriggling worms. He said, navigate us to Seven Sisters Road. I've never been to in my life, let alone from Ealing. That evening we did have an overhead projector which I was operating, and the retinal afterburn went on for about 2 or 3 days, I think.
So it's in the psychedelic era, right? So for the audience, what you're doing, what the light show's doing, and what the musicians are doing becomes very much part of the whole experience, particularly if people are tripping, right? So I wonder if you could talk about what effect you think the lights and the music together were having on the audience.
When you started asking that question, I remember when we started Optikinetics, we were still doing live light shows once a month for the first 2 years. I had, I think, about 500 slides. I remember I had a collection of stained glass window slides from churches, wrought iron gates from the front of fancy estates and things. But yeah, one particular slide I remember was Rupert the Bear, and I used to put that on a very long lens, central to all the other projections. Yeah, just in case anybody was having a bad trip and there was something nice and friendly and homely in the middle of it all.
Were you aware also that this experience could be quite transporting?
Oh, for sure, yeah. I mean, we did often after a gig, people would come and talk to us, congratulate us. I can remember doing an all-night concert at the King's Cross Odeon with Arthur Brown's Kingdom Come, and after that some handful of people came to spoke to us, asked us if we actually worked with Arthur all the time, and it was the first time we'd ever worked with him, so it was spontaneous.
Yeah, I mean, at that time also people were used to watching black and white TV, right? So they only saw colour when they went to the cinema.
Yeah.
And then you do this light show, which was all Technicolor, right?
And beyond. That's a whole thing with the 60s. We didn't have colour television until 67, 68, and then it was only sort of piloting. So, I mean, no wonder light shows were impressive in full colour.
Neil, I'm wondering, can you give the listeners a quick description of the difference between the liquid wheel, the effects cassette and the picture wheel so they can try and visualise them? Which came first?
I mean, I think the liquid wheel's got to come first. Towards the end of the 60s, Krishna Lights developed a product called the liquid wheel, which a lot of people are familiar with because they've seen them at discos in church halls and so on. Kind of like a projected version of a lava lamp. Not as dynamic as a boiling liquid slide, more sort of passive but peaceful, but it's still being projected by converted slide projectors. The liquid wheel was 3 very thin 6-inch diameter discs that were glued together with spaces in between the 3 discs, so you effectively had 2 channels which were filled with immiscible fluids which were dyed. One was water-based, one was oil-based, and the other one was silicon. Then they cross over each other so you get secondary colours. The whole wheel is mounted on a slow-turning motor so that only a portion of the wheel is actually in the path of the beam of light of the projector. The motor effectively caused the liquids to flow and move around and in an unrepeatable pattern. You were asking earlier about what unique effects I had in my light show. One that was relatively unique was inspired by the control desk in the first Star Trek, what we call a radial moire pattern. I don't know whether Bridget Riley was the original designer of it, but it's just a lot of fine black and white lines coming out from the centre. And 2 of those overlaid caused the moire effect, sort of an animation. And I thought, I want that in my light show. When I befriended Krishna Lights in Goodge Street, I took that up to show them. Not only were they blown away, but I got on the phone to Peter Wynne Wilson, Pink Floyd's early lighting operators, who lived in a flat in Cambridge Circus with Syd Barrett as his lodger. They said, you should take us down the road to show Peter. And So I went down to Cambridge Circus. I showed him what I'd done with this large bull race, and he actually sort of smacked his head. That was called an effect cassette. Nothing to do with a video cassette or an audio cassette. And apart from the black and white moire effect, they developed other different patterns in the moire. I mean, one of them features on the front of the book, and there's more inside.
So the picture wheel came last, or the panoramic wheel, what do you call it?
Well, instead of a liquid wheel, it was a wheel that had a fixed pattern on it that was either produced photographically or by screen printing. It's kind of like making a painting, but standing in the middle of the artwork and painting it all around you. So if you're putting in a picture disc, the disc has to be painted with the top of the picture at the outside of the wheel and the bottom of the picture in the middle. Obviously abstract designs, it doesn't matter.
But you didn't stay at that Krishna Lights location for very long, did you?
After Gouge Street, Krishna Lights opened a basement out in Acton for the production. And Keith and I and a couple of other guys got disillusioned. Around the corner was a shop called Light Sound Studios. The manager there, a chap called Peter Cutchy, he introduced Keith and I to a chap called Phil Brunker. He was converting slide projectors and making liquid wheels. Keith and I decided to leave Krishna and together with Phil start our own company.
Where were you based?
We decided that London wasn't the place to be manufacturing. We were looking to rent somewhere where we could live and work communally, keep our overheads down and get the company off the ground.
So you lived together, worked together, you and your wife Sally got married, and was this some sort of countercultural community, or was it just a sort of practical?
It was practical, but...
That's quite intense though, isn't it, living and working together?
Oh, for sure, yeah. Us guys got on all right, but the three ladies, my two other partners had been married for a while. Phil Brunker toured Europe with the Human Family, with Peter Wynne Wilson in a geodesic dome doing performances. He got chucked out of Switzerland for vagrancy, but he'd met a lady there and she followed him. They had a bus. When they got to Amsterdam, the Amsterdam police actually tipped the bus in. That was the end of that. So they came home. Phil brought Gabby to England. They married. After 6 months in England, her visa had expired, so it was a marriage of convenience. Keith Cannadine had done the sound for Donovan on tour in America and come back, but he knew about early electronics. We were down to commercialising. It was capitalism over hippiedom. And to come right round to answer your point was that Keith had come from Welwyn Garden City, but that was in the mod days when all the pills were getting stolen out of the drug factories around Welwyn Garden City. And by moving to London and going on tour in America with Donovan, he'd managed to shake all that off, although he had succumbed to heroin. And when I first met him at Krishna Lights, he was cleaning himself up. But moving into Hatfield, next door to Welwyn Garden City, all his old mates came out the woodwork and found us living communally in a farm, and it got a bit difficult for Keith.
Right, so we're talking about late 60s, early 70s now, so
yeah.
Obviously the counterculture, as we call it, was in full flight, right?
Well, it was in full flight, but it was also changing because the bands were becoming more famous and playing larger venues. I mentioned, seeing John Mayer and Eric Clapton in a youth club with 30 people. I mean, that wasn't happening anymore, so bands were becoming supergroups, playing larger venues. Larger venues, you need lots of stage lighting. That wasn't to say that light shows did go on. I mean, typically Hawkwind were famous for having a sort of handful of other bands. I mean, Pink Floyd were still using a bit of projection, but I mean, they had the money to have higher powered projectors. It was a case of the power of the projectors. They just weren't strong enough to punch through stage light. And also, I mean, the egotism. Whereas in the 60s, the bands were happy to hide in the light show and be anonymous. No, they didn't want to be famous and be recognised in the street, but of course that all changed. We were still selling converted slide projectors and our own first custom-made projector side by side, and then we bit the bullet and designed what's called the Solar 250 projector.
But this projector became the industry standard, didn't it? How many did you sell in the end?
The number was close to 70,000.
But the world was changing. I mean, music was changing, and as Kev was saying earlier, this first era of the light show went into a decline, right? But what happened next?
Oh, for the best part of the first 10 years, the business actually grew. And being naive, young, hippie businessmen, we assumed that's what happened forever. Got to the end of the 70s, there was recession, Our product had gone out of fashion and we had major competition. In Europe, the other major producers of lighting equipment were Spain and Italy, with all their discotheque clubs in resorts, but with a product that was called a pin spot. And they used to have them in the clubs. There was one shining on every ashtray in every Spanish and Italian club. And from that, they got to motorising them. And they used to make them sweep backwards and forwards. It's the kind of thing you would have seen along with the illuminated dance floor in Saturday Night Fever. Oh, and also the reason you saw the beam of light was, in those days, it was primarily smoking, but also the advent of a smoke machine, so you could see these beams of light. So that was another factor that stopped us being able to project onto a wall, because it hit the smoke and didn't go as far as the wall. My partner had a health issue, left the company, left me holding the baby. Our business just nosedived, came up with a bunch of new products, built the company up again. Instead of trying to get an image onto a wall, we came up with what are called beam effects, which was either the wheel or the cassette, but it would just have a slit across it and some colours behind. And that would be projected through the smoke, and you would actually see the effect looking at the projector, physically turn the product around, both in terms of its usage and its sales.
And that's basically where what I would call the first generation of the light shows really ended.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say it staggered on with a few enthusiasts. And, yeah.
I know you did some shows in the 90s with bands like The Orb, which we don't really touch on in the book, but how did things like that come about?
At the end of the 80s, along came the rave scene, and by standing still, our product was back in fashion. If you're breaking into a warehouse tonight to hold a party, then using projectors to quickly decorate the place was, we had a new breed of lighting designer. A lot of these guys came direct to us, and we developed relationships with them and actually went out and helped them with gigs and raves and things, and just got embroiled. I mean, the rave scene to me was like a renaissance of the 60s. My son was a teenager at the time, so he was the favourite boy in class, because a number of times we drove up to Manchester and back in the night for, Stone Roses and Happy Mondays and all that stuff. So, all his classmates would be, "Can I come with you and your dad?" I just remember one time we went to G-Mex, and the Mondays and 808 State, were playing a home gig. We were 2 of 800 on the guest list. I mean, it was one of those gigs that 808 State blended straight into the Mondays. I mean, by the time the Mondays came on, the atmosphere in that place, I hadn't felt anything like it since the 60s. It was just overwhelming.
Here's another bit from British Pathé. Swinging Britain in the 60s, a psychedelic dream.
Intro's photographer and reporter are here, where Keith Alban has laid them on a happening. A psychedelic dream, whatever that means, for good, old-fashioned cash. Scenery that is surrealist plus, just as a background. And colour, such as you might see in a hallucination dream. For no particular reason, join in a happening to the beat of the 117 group.
And also, should we just say that Neil was at the Acid Mother Temple gig only last week, right?
It was, yeah.
Doing the business. Well, listen, we're also accompanied today by Jenny Caldwell. Light J. That's the first time I've actually had a chance to use that phrase.
Light jockey.
Light jockey, yeah. Welcome, Jenny. Give us a quick introduction.
Okay, hi, I'm Jenny Caldwell. I worked with Anarch Lights in the 90s and then went on to do lots of projection.
So, Jenny, you started projecting in the early 90s, and I'm interested in the scene that you came into before that. What gigs were you going to, and what was it like? Was it live or club music?
Both. I used to go to a little club called the After Dark Club in Reading, which is quite iconic. It's almost a cult place to go. They had a few lights in there, but nothing sort of projection-wise. But no, it was in the early 90s I met Pogle, and he was doing Hawkwind. He was already doing Hawkwind at that time, and he asked me to come and do a little bit of design for him from the letterheads thing, but I ended up designing the slides and the wheels that went into the light shows, and I just totally set my brain on fire. I loved it. And then I started operating the light shows as well, so then I was hungry for more effects. I was introduced to Neil Rice, so I had all of those effects at my fingertips, but I was creating lots of artwork, and Neil was able to facilitate me making those into our own wheels as well, but we were also sort of sticking bits of glue under the grill with, like the glass paint and what have you. So yeah, it was just a lovely period of experimentation.
And what sort of gigs were you lighting?
Obviously Hawkwind, and they were sort of playing big theatres and stuff. So at one end Pogle and I were going into big theatres, presenting these quite large-scale light shows. And then at the other end we were doing free festivals where we would rock up with Wango Riley's Travelling Stage, which might ring a bell with some people, and we'd set up a light show actually in the stages or in the back of a truck with the side that went down, and we'd put all the lights in, and then it would drive to some common somewhere, and the side would go down. It would be plugged into a big generator on a fire engine, and bang, the band was on stage. And
this would have been the early 90s?
Yeah, that was early 90s. And of course Hawkwind played those free festivals as well, so that was quite the scene. And then on the periphery of that, the rave, the rave beats were coming in. It was probably already going on, but mainly the free festival and that side was live bands happening, but you could hear the beat happening, and some of the tents and the little marquees would be having the rave going on. And of course all the projections sort of lent itself to the crazy sort of Bridget Riley effects and wonderful cassettes. And
dance music didn't really permeate the main stages at Glastonbury though until about the mid-90s. I mean, it was on the periphery for some years, but going back slightly, I felt that Hawkwind were one of those bands that kept that thread of the light shows going.
But I think they influenced the rave culture as well, their sort of trance and hypnotic music. I think, they fed into that, very much.
So when you said Pogo was doing the lights for Hawkwind, what form did that light show take in the late 80s?
Well, the very first light show that I saw Pogle do for Hawkwind was actually for Central TV. And so it was quite a sort of the production side of it, and the camera-wise, it was quite high-tech. But at the back of the studio, there was this enormous scaffold, which you sort of clamber up on, and it was just filled with a couple of layers of slide projectors, 16mm, sort of splodoscope type effects.
What's a splodoscope?
Splodoscope.
Can you explain?
Now you're asking. I think air being pumped in from a fish tank pump sort of effect that would push air into the coloured oils to make it bubble. Is that a good description? So you'd be adjusting the airflow so that the oil would bubble in front of the lens and project sort of different effects. Lots of effect wheels, of course, from Optikinetics. It was a whole sort of plethora of different manufacturers, but also sort of homemade effects as well. Dozens of projectors all just lined up on this big scaffold and with wires going everywhere. I mean, if you went to a light show now, it's all coming off a laptop effectively, and they might have a wing to operate it from, but in those days we had loads and loads of different little controllers, so you were literally climbing all over the scaffold, changing the slides by hand, nothing was automated, changing the wheels by hand, all with screwdrivers for each song, or as things were evolving in the light show. It was quite chaotic.
Jenny, if you were doing a gig with a band like Hawkwind, did you prep stuff in advance? Did you think, okay, during this track, Space Ritual, for example, you're going to be doing these sort of lines?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm a researcher, so I'd want to know everything about the song in advance, and I'd be given the set list. One of the things I had noticed that some of the light shows that I had seen, the psychedelic light shows, it just felt to me like it was just randomly being thrown at the screen. That's not to criticise, I mean, that's a style. But I wanted to choreograph it a little bit more and make it a little bit more textured. And because I was also using parkans and other effects, some of them that Neil spoke about with the moving little pin spots and things, if you put on, I mean, it was light, if you put everything on at the same time, it just all goes white. So less is more. That was always my mantra. So you know, I wanted the images to mean something as well to the song. So I try and kind of interpret it and make things fit. And that's why, really, I started to design and source my own slides and wheels, because I wanted to just sort of layer things in and bring things in a little by a little, and then pull everything out and make it go really dark, and then just have one little thing on it. So when you're doing a light show, you hold things back, you hold colours back, and then when the big break comes in the music, bam, you know, you can wash it with loads of, you know, red, and then put all the black and white effects on, and, you know, but it's just a little at a time.
Well, could you talk about the combination of music and image together? I mean, how do they amplify each other?
Well, I mean, I often felt like part of the band, and I'm a flautist, so I played in orchestras and bands growing up, so I was quite musically orientated. So I'd be watching the drummer for the cues, and you get a feel for it. So you're feeling along with it, and particularly with bands like Hawkwind, where some of it might be quite improvised. You're trying to sort of pick up the subtleties in it and react to that and become part of it. And you know when you've got it right, because you can almost feel that collective intake of breath from the audience, and it's magical. I mean, you know, it's when it all comes together. It's not one thing in isolation, so it's not just the light show. In a way, I used to feel if people did come and say good light show at the end, I wanted them to think of it as the whole thing, as the whole immersive experience.
And is it like certain types of music work better with those kind of lights? I mean, for instance, Hawkwind, they're quite krautrocky, quite repetitive. And then in the 60s, when you have people like Pink Floyd and Soft Machine doing lots of improvisation, I mean, does that kind of music work best rather than like a singer-songwriter?
Personally, I think you could probably apply it to all music effectively, because anything that can be photographed or reproduced can be used in a projection light show. That was my view. I mean, I went on to do heavy metal. I got picked up by a Swedish heavy metal band called Tiamat when I've been doing Hawkwind for maybe about 5 years, and I was doing a show in Stockholm, and they came to see Hawkwind, and they liked it and had a word with me and gave me 6 weeks' work in January, which, you know, in lighting terms, that was unheard of. You take that work, you know, and I was really nervous about it, because it was really, I mean, it was heavy metal music, death metal, and of course, you know, all the graphic projections and things are quite punchy, so I was maybe using more conventional lights, and then I would use the projection as an emphasis, but you could have very, very quiet moments in it as well.
How did you react to that over someone like Hawkwind?
Tiamat, they had taken a lot of drugs, so they had moved from being, you know, that really full-on industrial sort of sound to introducing more delicate things into their music. So it was ideal for me to bring in more delicate projections and slides and wheels, and but lots and lots of black and white graphic patterns that were, you know, really impactful. And of course you had the ability to strobe it and fade it in. And
I'd imagine doing liquids on clock faces would have disappeared by this point.
Yeah, it was difficult to actually sort of operate that and operate a conventional lighting desk. And at that stage, maybe at the end of the 90s, I was using more conventional lighting desks, and I was using bigger rigs. So I was mixing a lot of projection with conventional lighting, like parkans and moving lights and stuff, but layering it. And I think all of that works really well together. It works beautifully together, as long as you just don't use everything at once. Less is more.
And that was quite radical for a heavy metal rock band, I take it.
It was great as well, because a lot of the audience hadn't seen any of this psychedelic, so-called psychedelic lighting before, so they thought this was all new. And I was saying, look, you know, the hippies have been doing this for years. But I was sort of bringing it to a whole new audience, and we were doing massive festivals out in Europe with these huge high-powered projectors from Optikinetic. So it was a fantastic thing to be able to do.
Can I ask you about the drugs aspects of it? I mean, it's the second summer of love, so ecstasy's come in, and acid back a bit as well, I suppose. Did that change things in terms of the audience and what you projected?
The raves were, there was definitely a lot of drugs going on in the raves. Personally speaking, I experimented in all that world, but I found it really difficult. I had one or two instances where I'd had some mind-altering substances and found it actually really difficult to coordinate the light show because there's so many things that you have to be dexterous with and alter and adjust and operate, and it could all just go to mush if you're not, I didn't find that an easy flow personally. From the audience's point of view, I had a feeling that I would have liked to think that they could almost gain an altered state from the visuals in themselves in a sort of hypnotic way, but there's no doubt that there were a lot of drugs going on, particularly at Hawkwind, maybe mostly hash and things like that.
You and Pogle ultimately parted ways. Would you like to talk a bit more about what happened with that situation if it's not too much of a sore subject?
Halfway through, about 1990, he got caught with quite a substantial amount of cannabis, rather large amount, in his car, and he was given 3 years. And I was left with all the lighting equipment and everything, and it was kind of a case of the police were looking to confiscate all the equipment. They didn't manage to pin anything on me, even though I'd been in the house when they'd, done the whole raid and everything. And also there was an impending Hawkwind tour. So Dave Brock was on the phone panicking. Oh no, what about the tour? And I was like, oh, don't worry, Dave, it's fine, we'll sort it out. And then put the phone down. It was like, oh shit, what am I going to do? And a chap called Adi and I went out and did that first tour, and really, I didn't know anything. It was a baptism of fire. I barely knew how to plug some of the stuff in, and because Pogle and Adi had always been there. So anyway, Adi and I went out and I did all the front of house, and I just kind of worked it out, and a lot of it was my own artwork anyway, so I knew how I wanted it to look. And as the tour progressed, I got better and better at it, and I got quite passionate about the technical side of it as well. So Pogle was in prison. I visited him all the way through. I don't think this would happen now, because when he got initially arrested and sentenced, I went to the bank there. I was only in my early 20s, and said, look, my boyfriend's just been arrested for selling cannabis, and the bank accounts have been frozen and I don't know what to do. And he was absolutely taken aback, and he said, I've never had anybody come and see me and say anything as honest as that. He said, I've never known that. He said, well, I'm going to help you. And he opened a bank account and allowed me then to run Anarch lights. Also, obviously, we had a lot of equipment from Optikinetics. So I went to see Neil, and Optikinetics were very supportive and helped me with a lot of, technical advice and help. And I think we owed them quite a lot of money there, and Adi and I were able to go out and carry on touring and sort of pay back in instalments, and Neil was very good to me. So
But your relationship didn't really survive that separation, right?
I think he did 18 months in the end. Yeah, the relationship broke up really. There was a massive age difference between Pogle and I, and by the time he came out of prison, I was out on tour and I was being given more and more work. I found something that I was good at. I had the artistic bent to do it, and things were getting booked. The debts had been paid off. I bought him a car, but our relationship didn't work anyway, it's safe to say. And I carried on touring and he carried on for a little while. And it was the best thing, I think it was the best thing to cut those ties.
And what happened after that?
I was doing all sorts of things. I was also working for the BBC and lots of other people. Tiamat supported Black Sabbath, so I ended up working on their crew. I did a little bit projection for Black Sabbath. My work now is more lighting installation, so I design lighting installations. They're more sort of kind of immersive experiences, and I make props and things like that. But I have worked with Neil over the years to go and, if there's quite an exciting project, I might get invited to go along and play, and it's nice because it's meeting up with old friends. And we did the Sun Ra at the Barbican, didn't we? The Sun Ra gig was a notable one, I think.
Terrific. All right. Well, listen, Jenny, thanks very much for coming to the Bureau of Lost Culture.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And Neil, thanks very much for coming to the Bureau of Lost Culture.
Thank you very much for having me.
And Kev, thanks for coming back to the Bureau of Lost Culture. Come again, and congratulations again on this book. It's like a little bit of British art history, Forgotten Corner, and Four Corners, of course, they publish it. That's what they specialise in, isn't it?
That's right, yes. Thanks for having me.
Thanks to you guys for coming to talk about this. Tripping the Light, fantastic. Thanks to everybody for listening. We appreciate you. Come and join us, bureauoflostculture.com. You can get our newsletter and make suggestions about who you would like to hear about on this show, or the subjects, countercultural, half-remembered, half-forgotten subjects you'd be interested in us digging deeper to find out about. We're going to finish, Kev, with a track which you dug up in your research, and it's a track from the era about the light show, isn't it?
Yeah, the Fantastic Zoo light show.
See you next time.
Close your eyes when you burst into flashing colours everywhere. Silver screens with pretty ladies, heedless of the blinding glare. Burning, burning sound sensations, crystal teardrops you will find. Sirens churning, feet are dancing, kaleidoscope of the mind. It's called a light show.